It's a great honor to be invited here. I'm very grateful for the groups that have invited me. Certainly the topics we're talking on are important ones. No question about that. I'm very grateful to being invited here to speak on them, and grateful to you for coming and listening, and grateful to the groups that have invited me. It's great to see such a wonderful honors program, which I was lucky enough to visit a class today and see exactly how exciting and engaging and successful this program is, and what it offers students and what students get out of it. Dr. Russell Kirk published a book on America's British culture. And at the end, he added an appendix on the topic of what did Americans inherit from the ancients. And he summarized his view as follows. In truth, America's political institutions owe next to nothing to the ancient world, although American modes of thinking about politics indeed were influenced 2 centuries ago by Greek and Roman philosophers long dead. My talk today will support Dr. Kirk's views on the influence of Greek and Roman philosophers on American thinking about politics. I'm going to avoid discussing his view on the institutions because I think he's wrong. I think that institutions are the embodiment of ideas, and you don't influence thinking without influencing institutions. That would be another talk, however, not one I'm going to give tonight, where I am going to concentrate, or at any rate build on, a confrontation with what no one doubts is one of the most important documents in American democratic thought, the Declaration of Independence. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson. His letter to Henry Lee on the Declaration, dated May the 8th, 1825, a little more than a year before his passing, at Monticello. It's a well-known letter. I'll quote a few relevant sentences. This is Thomas Jefferson quotes, "This was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority, then, rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc." End quotes. Thomas Jefferson is clear. The Declaration of Independence was not composed to publish his personal opinions or original notions, and there was no one source for its ideas and language. You remember what he said. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. All its authority rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day. And I take harmonizing sentiments to be what we nowadays call consensus. Professor Michael Zuckert of Notre Dame quotes these words in his important book on the Declaration, the Natural Rights Republic, arguing forcibly for John Locke's influence on the Declaration and against classical influence. Professor Zuckert writes, quotes, "The version of republicanism to which the natural rights philosophy pointed was emphatically not classical republicanism." End quotes. He quotes Jefferson mocking Plato in an 1814 letter to the gentleman he refers to as Jefferson's cranky friend, John Adams. But nowhere in his book of over 400 pages does he quote the phrase, quotes the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc., end quotes. There have been other responses. For political theorist James Stoner of LSU, quotes, "The theoretical paragraph of the Declaration sketches a political doctrine that today we recognize as classically liberal. In contradistinction, I might add, despite Jefferson's claim to Aristotle's teaching," end quotes. Historians James West Davidson and Mark Hamilton Lytle, in their fine introduction to historical methodology called After the Fact, ignore the problem, end quotes. Quotes, "Historians' reconstructions of Jefferson's intellectual world, imaginative as they are, must remain speculative. We do not have Jefferson's direct testimony of what he was thinking, apart from a few recollections made decades after the event," end quotes. Gary Wills is impatient at what he calls Jefferson's, quotes, "crediting Aristotle of all people with formation of the background for his declaration," end quotes. Scott D. Gerber seems to have read a different letter, quotes, "In a letter to Lee, Jefferson acknowledged that he relied on Locke's second treatise, a work he regarded as one of the elementary books of public right." No comment, really. It was Carl Becker who popularized the Lockean thesis in 1922 in a classic book which remains the starting point for discussions on the Declaration. Let me quote Becker, quotes, "The Declaration in its form, in its phraseology, follows closely certain sentences of Locke's second treatise on government," end quotes. Professor Zuckard became Locke's paladin at the century's end. Jefferson himself denied using any one source, mentioned Locke as part of a tradition going back to classical antiquity. In an 1823 letter to Madison, 2 years before the letter to Lee, Jefferson treated Richard Henry Lee's charge that the Declaration was copied from Locke's treatise on government with the same amused contempt he had for the assertions of Colonel Timothy Pickering and John Adams that the Declaration's essence was contained in a pamphlet by James Otis. Jefferson wrote to Madison, quotes, "Pickering's observations of Mr. Adams, in addition, that it contained no new ideas, that it's a commonplace compilation, that its sentiments hackneyed in Congress for 2 years before, and its essence contained in a pamphlet by Otis. These may all be true. Of that I'm not to be the judge. Richard Henry Lee charged it as copied from Locke's treatise on government. Otis' pamphlet I never saw, and whether I gathered my ideas from reading or reflection, I do not know. I know only that I turned to neither book nor pamphlet while writing it. I did not consider it any part of my charge to invent new ideas altogether, and to offer no sentiment that had ever been expressed before," end quotes. Modern scholars reject or ignore Jefferson's testimony on a topic for which he is a primary source. This lecture will argue 3 points. 1, colonial Americans believed in a coherent tradition of ancient and Whig thinkers, including, but not restricted, to Aristotle and Cicero. 2, this tradition provides a key to a reading of the Declaration different from a purely Lockean one. And 3, despite all the differences among the 4 figures Jefferson mentions, there's an important political theme to which they all contributed. Jefferson's statement of the role of Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney in expressing the harmonizing sentiments of the day on which the authority of the Declaration rested makes sense only if Americans felt there was a common tradition linking ancient authors and modern Whigs. Jefferson's memory is confirmed by a number of sources. Let's go back 50 years from the letter to Lee. 1774, Tory pamphleteer who composed under the almost unpronounceable name of Massachusettensis, say that 3 times fast, supposed to be, last name's Leonard, we're told, described Whig rabble-rousers stirring up crowds against the crown. Quotes, "They begin by reminding the people of the elevated rank they hold in the universe as men, that all men by nature are equal, that kings are but the ministers of the people, that their authority is delegated to them by the people for their good, and that they have the right to resume it and place it in other hands or keep it themselves whenever it's made use of to oppress them, end quotes. John Adams read these words and quoted them, which are clearly a version of the Declaration's self-evident truths, and responded in his Letters of Novanglis on January the 23rd of 1775, quotes, "These are what are called revolution principles. They're the principles of Aristotle and Plato, of Livy and Cicero, of Sidney, Harrington, and Locke, the principles of nature and eternal reason," end quotes. John Adams in 1775, like Thomas Jefferson in 1825, attributed the principles of the Declaration's list of truths that all men are created equal, etc., to a tradition of ancient thinkers and 17th century Whigs. Adams supplements Aristotle and Cicero with 3 more names. In 1766, preacher Jonathan Mayhew attributed the doctrines of civil liberty that guided the colonists' opposition to the Stamp Act to a tradition that included ancient classics and modern Whigs in his 1766 sermon on the repeal of the Stamp Act, called The Snare Broken. Quotes, "Having been initiated in youth in the doctrines of civil liberty as they were taught by men such as Plato, Demosthenes, and Cicero, and other renowned persons among the ancients, and such as Sidney and Milton, Locke and Hoadley among the moderns, I liked them. They seemed rational," end quotes. Jefferson's memory in 1825 was accurate. All American Whigs thought alike on these subjects. That the classical tradition was the source of Whig thinking about political freedom, citizenship, and tyranny was recognized by Tories as well as Whigs. Let's jump back 100 years. Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, published in 1651, when John Locke was 19 years old, quotes, this is Hobbes, from his perspective. "In these western parts of the world, we're made to receive our opinions concerning the institution and rights of commonwealths from Aristotle, Cicero," have we heard those names before? "And other men, Greeks and Romans, that living under populous states derive their rights not from the principles of nature, but transcribed them into their books out of the practice of their own commonwealths, which were popular. And by reading of these Greek and Latin authors, men from their childhood have gotten the habit, under a false show of liberty, of favoring tumults, and of licentious controlling the actions of their sovereigns, and again of controlling those controllers with the effusion of so much blood that I think I may truly say that never was anything so dearly bought as these western parts have bought the learning of the Greek and Latin tongues," end quotes. And he says later on in Leviathan, "As to rebellion in particular against monarchy, one of the most frequent causes of it is the reading of the books of policy and history of the ancient Greeks and Romans. From the reading, I say, of such books, men have undertaken to kill their kings, because the Greek and Latin writers in their books and discourses of policy make it lawful and laudable for any man so to do, provided before he do it, he call him tyrant. Well, they say not regicide, that is killing of a king, is lawful, but tyrannicide, that is killing of a tyrant," end quotes. The fact is, denouncing Whig use of the classics was standard Tory polemic. Let's go back another generation, even beyond Hobbes. Sir Edward Coke, who lived from 1552 to 1634, wrote a commentary on the common law, especially its form in Littleton, which was the basis of 18th century Americans' view of the common law. Jefferson wrote to Madison, "You will recollect that before the Revolution, Coke Littleton was the universal elementary book of law students, and a sounder Whig never wrote, or of profounder learning in the orthodox doctrines of the British Constitution and in what is called English liberties," end quotes. Coke often quoted the classics. One of his major cases, very influential in America, was called Calvin's case. It dates to 1608. He based part of his argument on the law of nature. The law of God and nature is one to all, he said. In the course of it, he cites Virgil's Aeneid, Aristotle's Ethics 5 and Politics 1, and Cicero De Legibus 3 and De Officiis, Book 2, Chapter 42. Aristotle and Cicero. This appeal to the classics provoked his Tory opponent, Lord Ellesmere, who responded, quotes, "I will not stand by to examine by human reasons what Plato and Aristotle have written of this argument. They were men of singular learning and wisdom, but we must consider the time and the country in which they lived, and in all their great learning, they lacked the true learning of the knowledge of God. They were born and lived in Greece and in populous states. They were enemies, or at least mislikers, of monarchy. Their opinions, therefore, are no canons to give laws to kings, and kingdoms no more than Sir Thomas More's Utopia and such pamphlets as we have at every market, end quotes. In 1773, to go back to the period of our founding, the loyalist, Reverend Jonathan Boucher, deprecated the influence of the classics in his sermon on American education. Let me quote Boucher. He gives a very good contemporary Tory view. Quotes, "Whilst we read and study the classics as excellent models of all that is elegant and perfect in composition, let us take due care not to be misled either by their loose morals or any of their false notions of government." You're going to be sad to hear that I'm going to omit the part on the loose morals, though it's quite amusing. But let's go on to their false views of government. Quotes, "Thus guarded, we may read tribunician harangues against legal restraint without ever weakening that necessary and just subjection to those higher powers which were ordained by God for the benefit of men. We may admire the language and elegance of the composition, whilst we despise and detest its principles. But I have not been so heedless an observer of men and things as not to have seen instances in abundance of men of liberal, generous, and cultivated minds, lost and undone by the habit first acquired at school of reading only classics. Instead of loving Christian verity and purity, they have thus become content to grope and grovel in the darkness and filth of heathenism," end quotes. You have to admit, the Tories also wrote well. Whig and Tory disagreed on many things, but they agreed that the Whig views of tyranny and what seemed to Tories their irresponsible abuse of the word were developments of terms and ways of thinking about government that came from reading the ancient classics, including Aristotle and Cicero, to whom Adams and Mayhew add Plato, Demosthenes, and Livy. Let me go on to the next topic. Hobbes' insight that Whigs learned from the classics to justify rebellion by calling their king a tyrant is the key to understanding the Declaration of Independence. After the initial sentence promising, quotes, to declare the causes that impelled them to this separation, end quotes, and the end of list of self-evident truths, the charges follow. George III is a tyrant, and so has forfeited the loyalty of the colonists. People rarely exercise their right to alter or abolish the incumbent forms of government. And then Jefferson quotes, "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government," end quotes. The central claim then follows, quotes, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world," end quotes. More than half the text, what Dumas Malone, the great biographer of Jefferson, correctly described as the longest section of the Declaration, is devoted to a circumstantial documentation of the charge of tyranny. The word is the leitmotif of the list of grievances. Let me just quote the examples. Quotes, "He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only," end quotes. And at the end of the list of grievances, we read, quotes, "He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the work of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized state," end quotes. And finally, the argument is summarized, quotes, "A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people," end quotes. In his own draft, Jefferson hammered the point home. Quotes, Future ages will scarcely believe that the hardiness of one man had ventured, within the short compass of 12 years only, to lay a foundation so broad and undisguised for tyranny over a people fostered and fixed in principles of freedom." End quotes. The list of grievances marshals the evidence to support the charge that George III is a tyrant, and therefore rebellion and revolution, that is a return to free rule, is justified and necessary. Our difficulty in understanding the Declaration can be seen in the contemporary emphasis on one phrase from the list of self-evident truths: all men are created equal. The word equal appears once in the Declaration. The expressions tyrant, tyrants, and tyranny appear 4 times in the final draft, an extra time in Jefferson's rough draft. His expression arbitrary power was amended to absolute despotism by Franklin, and the expressions absolute rule and arbitrary government appear in the grievance on Quebec that was added by the Committee of the Whole. We should be wary of a reading that privileges a word that appears once in a document at the expense of ideas that occur a half-dozen times and allow a few lines to trump more than half the text. Let me continue. The Declaration's arguments that George III was a tyrant appealed to a long tradition that was widely understood and accepted by Whigs. It did not come from the common law, as Professor Stoner suggests, where the person of the king was unimpeachable, as Alexander Hamilton noted in Federalist 70, where he wrote, quotes, "In England the king is a perpetual magistrate, and it's a maxim that is obtained for the sake of the public peace, that he is unaccountable for his administration and his person sacred," end quotes. 1. Tyrant in ancient and Whig thought. The word tyrannos is found first in the fragments of the 7th century BC Greek poet Archilochus. In the late 5th century, the typical picture of a tyrant is already found in the debate on the constitutions in Herodotus, Book 3, chapters 80 through 82. The Persian noble Otanes defends democracy in chapter 80. Let me give my translation. Quotes, "The rule of the majority has the fairest name of all, isonomia, a regime of equal laws." His Otanes' critique of monarchy includes psychological analysis and typical traits. Quotes, "I'm going to say the worst. He upsets traditional laws, he violates women, and he kills men without trial," end quotes. The second trait was not relevant to George III, who was an excellent family man, but the other two appear in the Declaration's list of grievances. Quotes, "depriving us of the benefit of trial by jury, taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, altering fundamentally the forms of our government, abolishing the free system of English law in a neighboring province." That was added to Jefferson's. Both Herodotus and Thucydides describe and analyze the various regimes of the Greek world, including tyranny and democracy. Plato's description in Republic Book 8 and 9 of the cycle of governments from the rule of philosopher kings to democracy and then tyranny includes a memorable picture of the tyrant, which John Adams translated in his Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America from 1787, just before the Constitutional Convention. The classic discussion of tyranny in ancient political philosophy is Aristotle, Politics, Book 5, especially chapters 10 and 12. While not avoiding the moral condemnation found in earlier critiques, Aristotle discusses how monarchy and tyranny can be preserved or destroyed in detail and objectively. He's especially clear on the democratic and oligarchic traits of tyranny. To go on, in Livy's History of Rome, the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and his son Sextus exemplify all the traits of tyrants found in the Greek tradition. You'll remember from the rape of Lucretia, that the violation of women is found there, and there are also the other depriving people of their legal rights. Tacitus's Annals and Histories depict the political life of Rome under the absolute rule of the Caesars. The influential introductions Whig polemicist Thomas Gordon composed for his popular translation of Tacitus dwelt on the theme of tyranny. Cicero was the most studied prose author in the colonial curriculum, and the most popular of his philosophical works was De Officiis, on duties. As Maya Reinhold said, quotes, in 18th century America, Tully's offices, as they were called, as the work was commonly called, was much in vogue as a compendium of moral instruction for both youth and mature readers. It was in most libraries and is one of the earliest publications of a Latin text in America, end quotes. In this work, Cicero returns repeatedly to the figure of the tyrant, often exemplified by Julius Caesar. Not only is Cicero at pains to justify Caesar's assassination over and over again as tyrannicide, he never misses an opportunity to castigate Caesar by name or anonymously for his unlawful ambitions, his demagoguery, his resultant rapacity towards men of property, and his harsh treatment of Rome's enemies and subjects. Cicero's popular orations on the conspiracy of Catiline, Four Catilinarians, which were a standard part of the colonial curriculum, and his polemics against Mark Antony, the Philippics, depict Catiline and Antony with the traits of typical tyrants. By the way, the title of the orations against Antony is taken from the speeches called Philippics, in which the 4th century orator Demosthenes attacked Philip II, king of Macedon. The Whig concern or obsession with tyranny is the theme of the largest and central section of the Declaration. This concern is one shared with the ancient writers mentioned by Jefferson to Lee, Aristotle and Cicero, and the parallel statements of Adams, Mayhew, and Hobbes, Plato, Livy, Demosthenes. The list of self-evident truths in the Declaration's second paragraph implies a narrative of the development of consensual institutions found in ancient sources and Whig thinkers. Stephen Lucas commented in a rhetorical analysis of the Declaration, quotes, "Overtly, of course, the preamble consists not of a dramatic narrative, but of a series of propositions that begins in the opening sentence. Lucas sees, however, that the list of truths' powerful sense of structural unity is achieved partly by the latent chronological progression of thought in which the reader is moved from the creation of mankind to the institution of government, to the throwing off of government when it fails to protect the people's inalienable rights, to the creation of new government that will better secure the people's safety and happiness." End quotes. Lucas deduces this latent narrative from the list of truths. Americans in the 18th century knew that narrative from their classical curriculum. The self-evident truths are natural consequences of a widely held narrative of mankind's development from pre-political social life, a condition of freedom and independence, but without protection from oppression, first to a stage where a great man protected his followers, and then, when later kings abused their power, the establishment of the rule of law. It's found, for example, and very significantly for Whigs, in Cicero's De Officiis, Book 2, chapters 41 to 42. Let me give my own translation. "When in the beginning the majority were oppressed by those who had greater resources, they fled to some individual, outstanding in virtue, who, while he protected the weaker from injury, established fair dealing and reigned in the highest and lowest together, under equality of justice. The establishment of laws had the same cause as that of kings, for equal right to all has always been sought, and could exist in no other way. If the community obtained it from one just and good man, they were happy with him. When this did not happen, laws were devised to speak with one and the same voice at all times and with all men." End of Cicero. Livy's first book presents a circumstantial account of a new political society forming around good kings, followed by tyranny and liberation. John Locke does not disguise his patience with those who deny the historical character of this narrative, and therefore his deductions from it, which are those of the Declaration's list of truths. Here's Locke's comment, quotes, "He must show a strange inclination to deny evident matters of fact, when it agrees not with his hypothesis, who will not allow that the beginnings of Rome and Venice were by the uniting together of several men, free and independent of one another, amongst whom there was no natural superiority or subjection." End quotes. The Roman narrative developed from one fashioned by Plato and Aristotle. Plato Republic Book 2 tells of men forming communities, at first to satisfy basic needs, and then additional desires, until they need an army to protect them. Republics 8 and 9 traces the degeneration of the regime of the philosopher kings into timarchy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny, sketching both the character of the regimes and of their rulers. The degeneration of each regime's way of life leads naturally to the rise of the next. For John Adams, in his defense of the Constitution, quotes, "Plato has given us the most accurate detail of the natural vicissitudes of manners and principles, the usual progress of the passions in society, and revolutions of government into one another," end quotes. Aristotle in Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, traces the development of communal living. First, families unite into villages, which eventually form the final and most perfect association, in his view, the city-state or polis. He shares the basic narrative of Cicero, Livy, and Locke, but he treats it distinctively. Villages develop from families for Aristotle, not individuals. Aristotle does not need royal misbehavior to encourage the growth of the rule of law, because for him, citizenship is by nature the telos of a fulfilled human life. Anthropos politikon stoon. A man is a creature born for citizenship, or literally a political animal. The figure John Locke cited most often for transmitting the form and meaning of the ancient narrative was 16th century Protestant divine Richard Hooker. Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, Book 1, Chapter 10, sketched the growth of social and political institutions from what Hooker called those times wherein there were no civil societies, as yet no manner of public regiment established. Hooker combined the Greek narrative, where political life develops of what he called a natural inclination whereby all men desire sociable life and fellowship, with the one found in Cicero and Livy, where the conflicts endemic to social life leads to monarchy. Hooker quotes, "Men always knew that strifes and troubles would be endless, except they gave their common consent, all to be ordered by some whom they should agree upon," end quotes. Eventually, power tends to corrupt. Quotes from Hooker. "They saw that to live by one man's will became the cause of all men's misery. This constrained them to come unto laws," end quotes. Hooker supports his narrative with references to the book of Genesis, Aristotle, Politics 1-2, Cicero, De Officiis, Book 2, 41-42. Aristotle and Cicero. Lord Chancellor Ellesmere, Cook's Tory opponent, knew this narrative in the age of Queen Elizabeth and James, and objected to it as pagan speculation in his response to Cook in Calvin's case. Quotes, "I will not stand to examine by human reason whether kings were before laws, or laws before kings, or how kings were first ordained, or whether the kings or the people did first make laws, nor the several constitutions and frames of states and commonwealths, nor what Plato and Aristotle have written of this argument. I'm interested in the English law." Cook, of course, is going over this whole narrative. Sir Robert Filmer, in the later part of the 17th century, objected to this narrative in his work Patriarcha, attributing it prejudicially to medieval scholastics, succeeding papists, and the divines also of the Reformed churches. He cited Hooker in support of his views. Sidney's discourses and Locke's two treatises defended the traditional narrative, citing, with rather more justification, the historical narrative of Hooker's Book 1. Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2. Cicero, De Officiis, Book 2, Chapters 41-42. Sidney's discourses, Locke's second treatise, admittedly differ in significant ways, but all present versions of the same general narrative that lies behind the Declaration's list of truths. Mankind's natural or original equality is important for Whig versions of the narrative, and Locke attributes it not to his own thinking, but to Hooker. This is Locke, quotes, "The equality of men by nature, the judicious Hooker," as he always refers to him, "the judicious Hooker looks upon as so evident in itself and beyond all question that he founds his ethics on it at Ecclesiastical Polity 1, Chapter 8. Locke granted the people were unequal in many ways. Yet," Locke writes, quotes, "all this consists with the equality which all men are in respect of jurisdiction or dominion over one another," end quotes. In the Whig interpretation of the narrative, men have no masters until they subordinate themselves to a stronger figure for pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. I'm quoting the Virginia Declaration of Right there. And other benefits necessary for a fulfilled human life, and so reasonably described as rights. When oppressive kings violate the natural law, the people appropriately introduce the rule of law. This view of the origin and development of government involves a tradition that stretches from Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero to Hooker, Sidney, and Locke. It was known to the delegates and the audiences they addressed from their classical curriculum. They found the Declaration's list of self-evident truths, natural deductions from an historical narrative found, as Jefferson told Lee, in ancient authors and 17th century Whigs, and directly relevant to a document declaring a people's independence from a monarch. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Livy differ in many and significant ways from Whigs like Sidney, Harrington, and Locke, but all agreed that monarchy is not the only natural and just form of government. Republics are also natural and just. A king who has forfeited his right to rule by violating the natural law is a tyrant. The Declaration of Independence depends on this view of tyranny, which is both classical and Whig. Its lists of truths imply a narrative of the development of consensual institutions that is both classical and Whig. We need to listen to Thomas Jefferson and reject the separation of Whig thought from its classical roots proclaimed by modern scholars, such as Harvard's Bernard Bailyn. As Carl Richard saw in his wonderful book on the founders and the classics, quotes, "To the founders there was but one worthy tradition, the tradition of liberty, and they would not have understood the modern historian's need to distinguish between the classical and Whig traditions and to measure the influence of one against the other." End quotes. Jefferson knew the sources of the Declaration and reported them accurately. He had not forgotten them, nor did he, like Henry V's veterans, remember with advantage by making things up. We may end up deciding that our nation needs to reject or modify aspects of its political culture that are the legacy of ancient Greece and Roman political thought and practice. The idea of the citizen, the mixed constitution, checks and balances, the opposition of the rule of men and the rule of law. Thinkers as brilliant and insightful as Thomas Hobbes have found them unrealistic and unpersuasive. What we should not allow to happen, however, is a rewriting of our history that ignores the central role of the classical tradition in general and Greek philosophy in particular in America's practice of consensual rule and the principles we use to interpret our practice. Our free institutions and the way we think about them have been shaped and molded by the institutions and philosophy of classical antiquity. If we turn away from them, we need to be clear in our minds that we are rejecting what was considered the fundamentals of freedom for thousands of years. As John Adams wrote his friend, the patriot Dr. Benjamin Rush, "I should as soon think of closing all my window shutters to enable me to see as of banishing the classics to improve Republican ideas." Thank you for your kind attention.